Welcome students to exercise 36, which focuses on the anatomy of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is actually in two chapters in your lab manual, 36 which focuses on the anatomy and 37 which focuses on the physiology. So that will be a separate lecture about respiratory phys. So what do we have a respiratory system for? What is the purpose? Well, its main job really is what we call respiration, which is getting oxygen into the body so we can use the oxygen for aerobic respiration to make energy, and then getting rid of the carbon dioxide that is a waste product of that aerobic respiration. The respiratory system then has a couple of accessory functions, including olfaction, speech, and actually through the kind of excretion of CO2, also helping regulate our pH balance. There are 4 processes that are associated with respiration. 2 of them are carried out by the respiratory system. The other 2 are actually carried out by the circulatory system, not the respiratory system, although we study them here in the circulatory system. So pulmonary ventilation is what we think of as breathing, moving air into and out of the lungs. That is an exclusively respiratory system process. External respiration is then the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood in the lungs and the alveoli in the lungs themselves. So we're picking up oxygen, we're getting that into the circulatory system, and we're getting carbon dioxide out. Then, once we have those gases in the circulatory system, they're going to move around the body. That is carried out by the circulatory system, right? That's not, it's considered a respiratory process, but it's really the circulatory system that's transporting our respiratory gases. Oxygen attached to hemoglobin primarily, and carbon dioxide primarily dissolved as bicarbonate in the blood, in the plasma. And then we have internal respiration, which is an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and all of the body tissues. So external respiration is more pulmonary circuit, internal respiration is more systemic circuit. So it's oxygen unloading out of the blood into the tissues so the tissues can use it, and carbon dioxide loading into the blood, coming out of the tissues so that it can be excreted and gotten rid of. If we look at the respiratory system and kind of how it's organized, we can look at what we consider the upper respiratory tract and then the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is the nose and nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx or throat. Sometimes we'll throw the oral cavity in there as well. So this is kind of all upper respiratory system. And then the lower respiratory tract is the larynx, the trachea, and then on into the lungs where we have the bronchi and all of their branches, and then eventually getting out, of course, to the alveoli where we primarily have external respiration taking place. So you can think of the respiratory system as kind of 2 zones. The conducting zone stuff are really just passageways. They're just tubes for air to move from the external environment to where gas exchange is going to take place. And then the respiratory zone structures are actually where respiration takes place. So the conducting zone structures is all of the upper respiratory system, the trachea, the bronchi, out to what we call terminal bronchioles. And then the respiratory zone structures are the respiratory bronchioles leading then into the alveoli. And so let's look at the upper respiratory system structures first, and then we'll go kind of down the tract, as it were. So starting at the nose and nasal cavity, the nose is, of course, kind of where we inhale the air. The cavity then sits behind the nose. And it's lined with a very particular type of mucosa. It's got a lot of blood vessels in that area, so that helps warm the air. It also helps humidify the air so that we're not breathing in cold, dry air, and it can also filter the air as well. And in the nasal cavity, it's not smooth. We have these kind of bumps almost, that we call them conchae, in the nasal cavity that interrupt the airflow so that the airflow is more turbulent, so it stays in the nasal cavity a little bit longer, which allows the respiratory mucosa to kind of further warm and humidify the air. So the oral cavity is really mostly part of the digestive system, right? It's the cavity where our mouth is. But sometimes, of course, we can breathe through our mouth. So sometimes we will include it as a respiratory system structure. And then, below the nasal and oral cavities, we then have what is called the pharynx, which is really the anatomical term for our throat. It connects those nasal and oral cavities with the lower respiratory tract, as well as the esophagus. So there are three main parts to the pharynx. And I'll show you those on a figure here in just a second. And then we get into the larynx, which is our apparatus for speech, and also making sure that air and food go down their kind of proper passageways. So let's take a look at kind of upper respiratory structures, and then a little bit here with the larynx as well. So we inhale air through the nares, the nostrils, separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity is the palate, hard palate made up of maxillae and palatine bones, and then the soft palate with the uvula here, which will actually close this way when you swallow food. But we're not talking about food just yet. We're talking about the passageway of air. So we inhale air through the nares into then the nasal cavity. And you can see here are the conchae, which kind of help interrupt the airflow, so that the air stays here just a little bit longer so it gets nice and warm and moist. Following the nasal cavity, we are then into the pharynx, which has three portions: the nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. From the three portions of the pharynx, then we want air to go down into the larynx here, and then eventually into the trachea. The larynx is a series of cartilages. It's mostly hyaline cartilage. This big prominent thyroid cartilage here is what is specifically prominent on men as their Adam's apple. We have cricoid cartilages that wrap around, and there's a whole series of cartilages, arytenoid cartilages, but really we're talking about making up the apparatus for speech. The only bit of the larynx that isn't hyaline cartilage is this structure right here, which is the epiglottis. And when you swallow food, the epiglottis will close over the trachea so that the food goes down the esophagus and not the trachea. If you've ever been talking and eating at the same time and all of a sudden you start coughing, it's because your epiglottis basically didn't know what to do. Like, are we trying to breathe, in which case I need to stay open, or are we trying to eat, in which case I need to close, and you end up getting stuff going down the wrong tube. In the larynx, you'll find a slit called the glottis, and then that slit is then kind of bounded by a vestibular fold on top, which is our false vocal cords, and then the true vocal cords and the vocal fold on the bottom. And the vocal folds are our voice box. When you are trying to talk, essentially air is coming up past this glottis slit, vibrating that vocal fold, and that is how you are then responsible for making sound. And then mostly we use our tongue and our lips to frame it into speech. I also want to point out the sinuses here, the frontal sinus here, sphenoidal sinus here. I think that's all you can see on these two. They are kind of lightening the load of the skull. They also help to warm and humidify the air. They're also resonance chambers for speech. So a couple different functions for our sinuses. If we then move into the trachea, so we're talking about this right here. So the trachea sits anterior to the esophagus. And one of the kind of key features for the trachea is the fact that it has what we call patency, which means it has an openness. It always stays open. And that is because in the submucosa, we have these hyaline cartilage rings. So the mucosa of the trachea is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then the submucosa is where we will find these seromucous glands that makes some of that nasally mucus that we associate. And then these hyaline cartilage rings that help to maintain the patency or the openness of the trachea. And then lastly, we have the adventitia, which is essentially just kind of fibrous tissue that wraps around the trachea. But you'll notice that the cartilage rings are not complete. They're a C shape, not a complete ring. They're open posteriorly here. That is so that when you swallow food and food is moving down your esophagus can kind of bulge almost into the trachea a little bit in case you're swallowing like a larger piece of food. But because of the rings, the trachea will always remain open. If we then go in, follow the trachea then branches into the two primary or main bronchi. That's what actually leads into the lungs. The main bronchi or primary bronchi then branch into what we call secondary or lobar bronchi, and then the secondary bronchi break into tertiary or segmental bronchi, and then they'll actually branch further and further and further, and the branches will get successively, the space will get successively smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're actually going to branch another like 15 times, including the three main ones here. The smallest of these structures are then the bronchioles, and then the terminal bronchioles are where the conducting zone structures stop. And then we're into the respiratory bronchioles, which will then lead into the alveoli, which are situated like little sacks of grapes at the ends of what we call the bronchial tree or the respiratory tree. The alveoli themselves are simple squamous epithelial tissue and that's surrounded by really extensive capillaries so that oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged all of the time. Oxygen loading into the blood, carbon dioxide unloading out of the blood. That gas exchange actually just takes place via simple diffusion, doesn't require any energy, just occurs all of the time, constantly. So the alveoli and all the bronchi, they're in the lungs. So we also have to look at kind of gross anatomy of the lungs themselves. Mostly what the lungs are alveoli. There's thousands of them in there. The rest of the lung is what we call a stroma, and it's this very elastic connective tissue. So there's a lot of kind of spongy, springy, elastic kind of rebound in the lungs, and it's again mostly due to this kind of stroma. The lungs are also indented medially on the mediastinal surface. That indent is called the hilum, and that is where all of the blood vessels, all of the lymphatic vessels, all of the nerves, all of the bronchi, that is where they enter and exit the lungs. The left lung has two lobes separated by an oblique fissure, so it has a superior lobe and an inferior lobe, with the oblique fissure in the middle, and it's a little bit smaller than the right lung because of the position of the heart. And in fact, the left lung has this little notch in it called a cardiac notch, and it's this little concavity for the heart to kind of fit into the apex of the heart there. The right lung is three lobes, so a superior, middle, and inferior lobe, separated by a horizontal and oblique fissures. So let's take a look. You can see here is the right lung with its the left lung with its two lobes, left superior lobe, left inferior lobe, oblique fissure. Right lung over here with the three lobes, superior lobe, middle lobe, inferior lobe, superior lobe and middle lobe separated by a horizontal fissure, middle lobe and inferior lobe separated by an oblique fissure. And here you can see the little concavity of the cardiac notch for the kind of heart placement. And then you can see here's the hilum, that's that kind of indent, and that is where all of the arteries are, all of the blood vessels, all of the lymphatic vessels, all of the everything kind of enters the heart, the lungs there. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of respiratory anatomy is the fact that your lung actually gets two blood supplies. So it's the pulmonary circulation and then also what we call the bronchial circulation. So the pulmonary circulation is the pulmonary arteries and veins that we've looked at previously. So the pulmonary circuit, right? So the whole purpose of this is to get to actually oxygenate all the blood and return it to the heart. So this is a very low pressure, very high volume system. It's all of the blood from the heart is going to the lungs from the right side of the heart to get oxygenated and then returning back to the heart. But the lungs are very active organs, so they need oxygen and nutrients as well. And so there is a separate circulation to the lungs that's actually part of the systemic circuit. And these are the bronchial arteries and the bronchial veins. So the bronchial arteries are going to provide oxygenated blood to the lung tissue, and then the bronchial veins are going to kind of drain the lung of the kind of quote-unquote used blood, and they will actually then merge with the pulmonary veins in order to bring the blood back to the heart. So this is systemic circulation, so very high pressure, very low volume. And that is the end of chapter 36.